Evolutionary Theory, Section 1, Developing a Theory. In this section, we'll start with some key ideas. We'll talk about how this theory developed over time. We'll talk about how Darwin's ideas were developed from his experiences. And then we'll also talk about how Darwin's ideas came from other scientists. So to start us off, a bell ringer. Make a list of some of the characteristics that birds have that can provide information about their diets. This picture may help you in deciding what characteristics a bird may have that could allow us to consider what it eats. The key ideas of this section: why is evolutionary theory associated with Charles Darwin? How was Darwin influenced by his personal experiences? And how was Darwin influenced by the ideas of others? A theory to explain change over time. The definition of evolution is a process by which species may change over time. Remember that when we're talking in science and we're talking about a theory is a broad explanation that has been scientifically tested and supported. It is different from a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an educated guess. We're taking some information and we're making a prediction based on some information that we already have in order to explain what we think the outcome to an experiment may be. A theory is slightly different. We have actually taken, in order to create a theory, we have to have performed some experiments, gained some data, and then analyzed that data, and that data had to have supported our original hypothesis. That hypothesis then can transition into a theory. And then if we were to go even further, and 100% of the time that theory was proved to be true, we would turn it into a law. Modern evolutionary theory began when Darwin presented evidence that evolution happens and offered an explanation for how evolution happens. So it took two steps here. It took him presenting his evidence that evolution happens, and then he had to offer an explanation as to how it happened. Like any other scientific theory, evolutionary theory keeps developing and expanding. There's changes to it often, and it ends up with some new information added based on new experiments that are performed. There's a number of scientists that have happened or that have tested this theory over the last 150 years, and then they've added new information to his ideas. Most of his ideas, including his main theory, remain scientifically supported based on some form of evidence. Darwin's ideas from experience. During Darwin's time, most people did not think that living things changed over time. So they would not have seen a graph like this that saw a natural occurrence in the atmosphere change over a number of years. So right here we've got a number of years, and there's a gradual increase to all of these levels of gases over that period of time. In fact, many doubted that Earth itself had changed at all. But Darwin saw that there was some evidence that there must have been at least some gradual changes in the past to get what he saw during his days. And his experiences provided him with evidence of evolution at work. He collected his evidence from the Voyage of the Beagle. His first evidence was gathered during the voyage that he took on HMS Beagle, His Majesty's ship, the Beagle. As part of his work, he collected objects on a number of different islands and a number of different continents as the Beagle traveled around the world. He was hired as a naturalist. He collected fossils, and he noticed that there were similarities to fossils and also living organisms. So some of the fossils that he collected, he looked at and he saw the characteristics were fairly similar between the fossil organism that he found and living organisms that he could actually go out and collect during the current days that he was performing his experiments. You can see here the voyage of the beagle. It started in England, traveled down to South America, around to the Galapagos Islands, and most of his data was actually collected in the Galapagos Islands. The ship then went all the way around to Australia, came through the Indian Ocean, came back to South America, and eventually returned to England. So he's most widely known for visiting the Galapagos Islands. While he was there, he collected a number of different species of finches. He noticed that the species of finch that he collected were very similar, but they had slight differences or slight adaptations compared to finches that were found either on the other islands of the Galapagos or the mainland of South America. So this is an example of some things that he noticed. He noticed that each finch had a bill that seemed suited to the finch's unusual diet. So if you were an insect eater, the bill may be a little bit longer, whereas if it was a nut eater, the beak would be much larger. So here are a variety of the finches that Darwin looked at. You can see the bill shapes are quite a bit different between a number of them. Some of their bodies looked quite different, and so you would think that Darwin's ideas would be kind of disputed based on the fact that the body structure and body shape looked quite a bit different. But he used some supporting evidence to help explain why he believed what he believed. Darwin also noticed that many of the plants and animals that were on that island or on those islands were similar but not identical to the plants and animals that he saw in South America. He later proposed that the Galapagos species had descended from species that had originally come from South America. You can see here the Galapagos Islands are off the west coast of South America, specifically Ecuador, right on the equator. And there's a number of different islands, and he noticed that a lot of the organisms found even on the different islands of the Galapagos had traits that were slightly different. So he suggested that all finch species descended from one ancestral finch that may have migrated from South America over to the Galapagos Islands. He then thought that the descendant finches over time would modify to better fit the environment in which they were trying to collect food. So if you had a thicker beak and there was more nuts available, that species would be able to survive better, or that individual would be able to survive better, and therefore it would have offspring with similar characteristics. He called this change descent with modification, and it was the major idea behind his theory. Darwin took a large number of years to reflect on his data that he collected. He didn't publish right away. So he returned on his voyage at the age of 27, and he spent years studying that data. He continued studying a large number of different sciences. He eventually grew more and more confident about his theory as he aged and as he collected more data. He did not report his ideas about evolution until much later in life. Instead, he took a large amount of time to gather that data to form a strong explanation for how evolution would occur. It wasn't until other scientists were getting ready to publish their own idea on the theory that Darwin actually went and published his book. Darwin also studied breeding and selection. So he took an interest in breeding exotic pigeons. So he studied the work of those who bred other kinds of animals as well, including plants. So dogs, orchids, food crops, all of those different things. He studied what happened in the outcome of organisms as they were bred together. So dogs, for an example, he studied that. And the idea was that we can breed for specific traits in dogs dependent upon the traits that we like. So if you wanted a smaller dog and you had two parents that had that trait, you would breed them together and you would end up with offspring that had similar traits. So eventually Darwin gained new insight. Breeders take advantage of natural variation in traits within a species now. So if a trait can be inherited, breeders can produce more individuals that have the trait. Breeders simply select individuals that have desired traits to be the parents, and then each new generation will end up with those traits. He called this process artificial selection. And so it was selection that is done by humans, not by the natural environment. So rabbits, perfect example of artificial selection. We actually can breed rabbits for a variety of traits. Do we want them to be small and petite and use them as kind of a show rabbit? Or do we want them to be large? Do we want them to be meat rabbits where we're actually breeding them for the use of food?
Charles Darwin traveled the world as a naturalist, making observations that helped him form his ideas about evolution. For example, in the Galapagos Islands he found different species of finches. Each had a different bill for eating different foods, but the species were so similar that they must have shared a recent common ancestor. Darwin formulated a theory with two parts. The first part states that newer species, like the finches Darwin found, are modified descendants of older species like the finch's common ancestor. The second part states that organisms that are best adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. In an area with only nuts to eat, a large ground finch will find food and a warbler finch will not, because the warbler finch's beak is not made for cracking nuts. In this case, the large ground finch is more likely than the warbler finch to survive and reproduce, passing its traits to its offspring.
So as I mentioned earlier, Darwin also took ideas from other scientists. During his time, most people, including scientists, believed that each species was created once and stayed the same forever. But the view could not help to explain fossils of organisms that no longer existed. For example, dinosaurs. So some scientists tried to explain such observations by saying that a species could die out but never change. Other individuals, including Darwin's own grandfather, proposed various mechanisms to explain how species may change over time. Darwin was influenced by ideas from a large number of different sciences, including natural history, economics, and geology. He took ideas from Lamarck, Malthus, Cuvier, and Lyell. So here's Lamarck, Malthus, Cuvier, and Lyell. All of these scientists played a contemporary role into Darwin's ideas. Lamarckian inheritance. Lamarck noticed that each organism is usually well adapted to its environment. So he proposed that organisms change over time as they adapt to changing environments. He believed that offspring inherited these kinds of changes, and his idea was eventually disproven. But it wasn't disproven during Darwin's time. So Darwin used his ideas as a way to accept the theory of evolution. So what Lamarck said was that if an organism was smart and learned over the course of its lifetime and continued to get smarter and smarter and smarter, it would have a child that would be the same intelligence. We know that that is now not true. There is no genetic basis for intelligence. Organisms pass on traits, yes, but they don't pass on the ability to be intelligent or the knowledge that was gained by their parents. It would be like somebody going into the gym and continuing to work out day after day after day and becoming very muscular and expecting that the child would come out muscular.
The French scientist Lamarck noticed that some life forms appeared to be modifications of fossil forms found in the same geographic location. Examine these two animals. The modern armadillo, on the right, resembles the extinct glyptodont. The two occupy the same geographic region and have a common ancestor which is also extinct. Based on this type of evidence, Lamarck related fossil forms to living animals based on similar appearance. To explain how species change, Lamarck studied shorebirds. He believed their webbed feet resulted from repeated stretchings of the membranes between the toes, and that this acquired trait would be passed on to their offspring. Although Lamarck's hypothesis was disproved, it was an important forerunner of modern evolutionary theory.
Darwin also looked at population growth, and he got his information on population growth from Thomas Malthus. So in 1798, the English economics professor, he observed that human populations were increasing faster than the food supply was. So he noticed in here, you can see this exponential growth curve that occurs with the human population right about the time that Darwin was doing a lot of his studying. Malthus pointed out that food supplies were increasing linearly. So that should be a science term you're used to. And more food was being produced each year, but the amount of food was not increasing at the same rate at which the human population was increasing. So he noticed that there was an exponential growth with regard to the human population. There was more and more people every single year, but the relationship was not the same with regard to the amount of food that was being produced. So he noted that the number of humans could not keep increasing in that way, because many people would probably die off from disease, war, or even famine. Darwin applied Malthus's ideas to all populations. Recall that a population is all of the individuals of the same species that live in a specific place. Darwin saw that all kinds of organisms tend to produce more offspring than can survive. So all populations must be limited by their environments. So this is a perfect example of that. The snowshoe hare versus the Canadian lynx. You can see where the snowshoe hare population increases. And a short while later, the lynx population increases. And as the hare population decreases, the lynx population soon decreases as well. So they are related to one another. It's called a boom or bust population graph. As food is available, the population increases. As that food becomes less available, the population decreases.
The exponential model and the logistic model are two types of models used for determining population growth. In exponential growth, both birth rates and death rates are assumed to be constant. Therefore, the larger a population gets, the faster it grows. For example, bacteria might divide at a constant rate to form new bacteria. The population only grows by one bacterium after the first 30 minutes, but grows by 2 bacteria after the next 30 minutes, and by 4 bacteria after another 30 minutes. The exponential growth curve is a J-shaped curve showing the rapid increase in population size over time under conditions of unlimited resources. The larger the population gets, the faster the population grows exponentially.
Darwin also took geology and studied the ancient Earth in order to develop his hypothesis, which turned into his theory. So in Darwin's time, scientists had become interested in the study of rocks and landforms, and so began the study of geology. Scientists such as George Cuvier and James Hutton, along with Charles Lyell, all of them studied fossils and rock layers. Cuvier argued that fossils and rock layers showed differences in species over time, and that many species from the past differed from those of the present. But Cuvier did not see species as changing gradually over time. He thought that changes in the past must have occurred suddenly. Hutton and Lyell, on the other hand, thought that geologic processes such as those that wear away mountains and form new rocks and fossils work gradually and constantly. So Lyell carefully and thoroughly presented his ideas in a book that Darwin read. Lyell's ideas fit well into Darwin's observations, and they showed that the Earth's history was long enough for a species to have evolved gradually, which is what Darwin believed. So our summary, modern evolutionary theory began when Darwin presented evidence that evolution happens and offered an explanation for how evolution happens. Darwin's experiences provided him with evidence of evolution at work. Darwin was influenced by ideas from the fields of natural history, economics, and geology.